It is easy to preach about family loyalty when the harvest is good, but the true nature of a parent is revealed when the pantry runs low. To the neighbors, my parents were hardworking victims of a bad economy, but behind closed doors they were accountants of cruelty. I am Maria Morton. Today, I own the largest food distribution network in the region. Yet every time I hear a fork scrape against a plate, I am transported back to the night they chose to feed my brother a warm meal and sent me away because I was an expense they could no longer afford. They thought they were cutting their losses, but today, they are about to find out that the bill has finally come due. There is a specific rhythm to a distribution center at 4 in the morning. It isn't quiet. It is a heavy industrial hum that you feel in your chest. If you close your eyes, you can hear the deep idling rumble of 30 diesel semi-trucks lined up at the bay doors. You hear the sharp rhythmic beep, beep, beep of the forklifts reversing, carrying pallets wrapped in plastic. You smell the exhaust fumes mixing with the sharp, sweet scent of 10,000 crates of apples and the earthy smell of unwashed potatoes. To most people, that combination of diesel and dirt smells like work. To me, it smells like safety. It smells like money. My name is Maria Morton. I am the CEO of Morton Logistics. If you live in this state and you bought a tomato at the grocery store this morning, there is a 90% chance my trucks brought it there. I control the flow of food for 3 million people. I decide whose shelves are full and whose shelves are empty. It is a strange life. I sign invoices for 10 tons of Gala apples without blinking an eye. I approve shipments of prime beef worth more than my first car. But as I stand here on the metal gantry overlooking my warehouse floor, I can't help but think of the irony. It's what I call the 3-second irony. It takes me 3 seconds to sign a check that could feed a family for a lifetime. But 14 years ago, I was the one extra mouth my father couldn't afford to feed. I looked down at the tablet in my hand. The screen was glowing with a notification I had been waiting on for a long time. It was an email from the county bank. Subject notice of foreclosure and liquidation auction, Morton's Market. The attachment was thick with legal terms, but the bottom line was simple. The debt was $2.5 million. The family grocery store, the business my grandfather built and my father inherited, had finally collapsed. They were bankrupt. I didn't feel happy. You might expect me to smile, but I didn't. I just felt a cold, quiet satisfaction. It was like balancing a ledger. The numbers finally added up. I tapped the screen to open the details. The auction was set for tomorrow at noon. But as a potential qualified buyer, I had the right to a pre-auction inspection. I had 24 hours to walk through the property and decide if it was worth buying. I wasn't going there to buy the rotting produce. I wasn't going there to save the business. I was going there to buy my past. The sound of a forklift dropping a heavy pallet echoed through the warehouse. Clang. That sound faded, and suddenly I wasn't in my warehouse anymore. The smell of diesel vanished. I was back in the dining room. It was 2011. It was raining outside, a cold November rain that rattled the single-pane windows of our house. I can still hear the sound of the silverware, that scraping noise of a fork against a china plate. It is the loudest sound in the world when nobody is speaking. I was 14 years old. I was sitting at the end of the table. My hands were in my lap because I had finished eating 5 minutes ago. My plate was clean. It was easy to clean a plate when all you were given was a scoop of boiled potatoes and a spoonful of canned peas. Across from me, my brother David was eating. He was 16. He had a pork chop. A thick pan-fried pork chop with the fat rendered down just right. I watched him cut into it. I watched the juice run out onto his potatoes. I watched him put a piece in his mouth and chew. He didn't look at me. He just ate. My father sat at the head of the table. He was staring at the wall, his face gray and tired. The recession had hit the store hard, or so he said. The suppliers were demanding cash up front. The customers were buying less. My mother was the one who broke the silence. She was wringing her hands in her lap, twisting her wedding ring round and round. "It's not forever, Maria," she said. Her voice was thin, like she was trying to convince herself. "It's just until the store gets back on its feet." "I don't want to go," I whispered. "I can help at the store. I can stock shelves after school." My father finally looked at me. His eyes were hard. There was no warmth in them, only calculation. He looked at me like I was a crate of lettuce that had gone bad, a loss that needed to be cut. "David needs to focus on the business," my father said. His voice was flat. "He's the heir. He needs his strength to run the floor. We can't have him distracted." "But why do I have to leave?" I asked. My stomach gave a loud, painful growl. The sound echoed in the quiet room. My face burned with shame. "We can't feed 3 adults and a child, Maria," my mother said, looking down at her own half-empty plate. "Not the way things are. Aunt Clara is getting old. She lives alone in that big house on the hill. She needs a maid. She needs a cook. She agreed to take you in. She'll feed you. She'll clothe you." "I'm not a maid," I said, tears stinging my eyes. "I'm your daughter." "You're an expense." My father slammed his hand on the table. The silverware jumped. "It's just math, Maria," he shouted. "It's simple arithmetic. We are drowning. We are cutting costs. You are going to Aunt Clara's, and you are going to be grateful that family is taking you in instead of the state. You leave in the morning." David kept eating his pork chop. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer me a bite. He just kept chewing, building his strength for the business that was supposed to be his legacy. I remember sitting there, the hunger gnawing at my ribs, realizing that the people who were supposed to love me had looked at the ledger and decided I was the line item they could live without. If you believe that no child should ever be treated like a financial burden by their own parents, please hit the like button to show you stand for dignity. I blinked, and the dining room was gone. I was back in my office. The hum of the warehouse returned. My hand was gripping the edge of my mahogany desk so hard my knuckles were white. 14 years. I had spent 14 years building a life out of the scraps they threw away. Aunt Clara had been hard, but she had been fair. She taught me how to work. She taught me that if you control the pantry, you control the house. And eventually, I learned that if you control the supply chain, you control the town. I picked up my car keys. They were heavy in my hand. I walked out of my office down the steel stairs and out the side door into the rainy morning. My car was waiting, a black German sedan that cost more than my father had made in his best year. I wasn't going to the auction house. I didn't need to sit in a room with lawyers. I wanted to see the building. I wanted to see the loading dock where the trucks used to come in. I drove through the city, the windshield wipers slapping away the rain. The streets changed as I drove. The clean industrial park gave way to the older, crumbling part of town. The part of town where dreams went to die. I turned the corner onto Elm Street. And there it was. Morton's Market. The sign was faded. The parking lot was full of potholes. The windows were dirty. It looked small. It looked tired. I pulled around the back toward the loading dock. I saw a figure standing there in the rain trying to pry open a rusted gate. Even from this distance, I recognized the slump of the shoulders. I killed the engine. The silence filled the car. I wasn't the hungry 14-year-old girl anymore. I wasn't the extra mouth. I was the one holding the fork. I opened the car door and stepped out into the rain. It was time to go say hello. The rain in this part of town didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. I parked my sedan 2 blocks away, tucked behind a derelict laundromat. I didn't want them to see the car. $100,000 vehicle stands out in a neighborhood where most cars are held together by rust and prayer. I stepped out into the drizzle. I was wearing a heavy, oversized raincoat with the hood pulled low. It was generic. It made me look like a ghost or a debt collector. Maybe I was both. I walked the alleyway toward the back of Morton's Market, the loading dock. This was where I used to play as a child, building forts out of empty cardboard boxes. Now the asphalt was cracked weeds shooting up through the fissures like desperate fingers. The sound reached me before I saw them. It was the harsh metallic rattle of a roll-up door stuck halfway on its tracks, followed by shouting. I stopped in the shadow of a dumpster. I could smell the rot from here. It was the sweet, sickly stench of citrus that had turned to mush. My father was standing on the edge of the dock. He looked older than the pictures I'd seen online. His spine, once rigid with pride, was curved into a permanent question mark. He was waving a sheaf of papers at a delivery driver who was standing by a white box truck. "You can't leave!" my father shouted. His voice cracked. "I have customers coming in an hour. I need that milk." The driver, a heavy-set man with a clipboard, didn't even look up. He was already latching the back of his truck. "No cash, no product, Mr. Morton. That's the rule. You bounced the last 3 checks. My boss says if I drop even a single crate of 2% without a certified bank draft, it's coming out of my paycheck." "I'm good for it." My father's voice was desperate, thin against the drumming rain. "I've been in business on this corner for 40 years. My word is my bond." "Your word doesn't clear the bank," the driver said. He climbed into the cab. The engine roared to life, coughing a cloud of black smoke into my father's face. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning on the wet pavement, and peeled away. My father stood there holding his useless papers, watching the milk drive away. Then I saw the glow of a cigarette. My brother David was leaning against the doorframe of the warehouse. He was in his early 30s now. He wore a dirty apron over a hooded sweatshirt. He watched the truck leave with a look of bored detachment, as if he were watching a television show he didn't particularly like. "Told you, Pop," David said. He took a long drag and exhaled the smoke toward the rain. "Should have tried the other supplier." "They're all the same," my father snapped, turning on him. "It's this economy. It's the government. Nobody respects small business anymore." David flicked his cigarette butt into a puddle. It hissed and died. "Whatever. We're out of milk. We're out of eggs." "What do you want me to do? Sweep the dock?" My father muttered, defeated. "I swept it yesterday." "Then sweep it again." I watched them bicker. It was pathetic. But the businesswoman in me, the CEO of Morton Logistics, wasn't feeling pity. I was feeling critical. I looked at the loading dock. There were 3 pallets of bananas sitting out in the rain uncovered. That was $500 of inventory ruining because nobody bothered to pull it inside. I saw empty crates tossed in a heap blocking the fire exit. That was a safety violation. This wasn't just poverty. This was incompetence. They claimed they sent me away because they couldn't afford me. They said they kept David because he was the future of the business. I looked at the future. He was lighting another cigarette while the bananas turned black. They didn't fail because of the economy. They failed because they were careless. I checked my watch. It was time. I adjusted my hood, making sure my face was in shadow, and walked out of the alley toward the front entrance. I wasn't Maria, the daughter, anymore. I was the representative from Highland Holdings. The office smelled exactly the same as it did 14 years ago. It smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and old dust burning on the baseboard heaters. The only difference was the silence. It used to be that the phone was always ringing. Now the phone sat on the desk, dusty and silent. I stood in the corner of the room. I kept my raincoat on. I kept the hood up. I told them I had a cold and didn't want to spread germs. It was a flimsy excuse, but desperate people don't question the quirks of the person holding the checkbook. My father sat behind the big oak desk. He was trying to look important. He had put on a tie, but it was stained. My mother was fluttering around the room. She looked frail. Her hands shook as she placed a styrofoam cup in front of me. "Coffee," she said, offering a nervous smile. "It's fresh." "Well, fresh enough." I looked at the black liquid. There was an oily film on top. "No, thank you," I said. My voice was low-controlled. David was leaning against the filing cabinet, arms crossed. He was trying to look tough, like he was negotiating a merger instead of a surrender. "So," David said, breaking the silence, "you're the buyer for the debt Highland Holdings." "I represent the liquidity fund," I said. "We are reviewing the assets before the bank seizes the property at noon tomorrow." My father cleared his throat. "It's a temporary setback, a cash flow hiccup. If your firm buys the debt and extends us a line of credit, we can turn this around in 6 months. We have the best location in the city." "Location doesn't matter if you have nothing to sell," I said. The room went quiet. I walked over to the window that looked out over the store floor. It was a ghost town. Entire aisles were empty. The produce section, the heart of any grocery store, was barren. Just a few wilting cabbages and those rain-soaked bananas they had finally dragged inside. "Ah, I reviewed your accounts payable," I said, keeping my back to them. "You owe $2.5 million, but what interests me is your supply chain." I turned around. I stayed in the shadows away from the desk lamp. "Why are your shelves empty?" I asked. "Supply chain issues," my father said quickly. "Global shortages. You know how it is." "I do know how it is," I said. "I know the market very well. There are no shortages of apples. There are no shortages of dairy. I checked your vendor list. You used to buy from Greenbelt Farms. You used to buy from Valley Fresh Distribution." At the mention of those names, my mother flinched. David shifted his weight, looking at the floor. "Why did Greenbelt cut you off?" I asked. They changed their delivery routes," my father lied. He smoothed his tie, his fingers trembling. "They stopped servicing this district." "And Valley Fresh," I pressed. "They are the largest distributor in the state. They go everywhere. Why did they stop delivering to Morton's Market?" David scoffed. "They got greedy. They started jacking up the prices. We told them to take a hike. We have standards. We aren't going to let some big corporate distributor gouge us. We dropped them." I felt a cold spike of anger in my chest. I knew the CEO of Valley Fresh. I knew him because I am him. Or rather, I own the parent company. I knew exactly why we stopped delivering to Morton's Market. It wasn't because of routes. It wasn't because of price gouging. It was because the system flagged the account for non-payment 6 months ago. We sent 3 warnings. We offered a payment plan. They ignored every letter. They didn't drop us. We cut them off because they were thieves who took the product and refused to pay for it. "So," I said, keeping my voice even, "you dropped the biggest suppliers in the region because of principles?" "Exactly," my father said, nodding vigorously. "Principles, reputation. That's what this family is built on. We'd rather have empty shelves than do business with crooks." My mother nodded in agreement. "We've always been an honest family. That's how we raised our children. To be honest, to pay their debts." The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it. It tasted like that oily coffee. They sat there facing financial ruin, facing the loss of their home, and they were still lying. They were lying to the investor, just like they lied to themselves. They lied about why the store failed. They lied about the vendors. And 14 years ago, they lied about why they sent me away. "We can't afford you." That was a lie too. They could have afforded me. They just chose to afford David's mistakes instead. "It's interesting," I said, "because if I buy this debt, I become your owner. I would need to know that the management team is trustworthy." "You can trust us," David said, puffing out his chest. "We're Mortons. We're the pillars of this community. We just need a chance." my mother pleaded. We just need someone to believe in us again. We've had such bad luck, but we're good people. I looked at them. The three of them huddled together in their delusion. They looked like a family, a tight, united front, and I was the enemy at the gates. Good people, I repeated softly. Yes, my father said. Ask anyone. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder. It wasn't the loan documents. It was the vendor account history for Valley Fresh. I don't need to ask anyone, I said. I prefer to look at the receipts. I took a step forward, moving out of the shadows and into the light of the desk lamp. Let's talk about the receipts, Dad. Have you ever dealt with relatives who care more about money and their own image than the truth? If you have, don't be shy to share your story in the comments. I read every single one. The air in the office didn't change, but the gravity did. I reached up with both hands and pulled back the hood of my raincoat. I shook my hair out. It was dry, styled, and expensive. I unbuttoned the cheap coat and let it slide off my shoulders, revealing the tailored navy suit underneath. The suit cost $3,000. It was the kind of suit you wear when you are about to acquire a company or destroy one. I tossed the raincoat onto the visitor's chair. I looked at my father. Then I looked at my mother. Finally, I rested my gaze on David. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy. It pressed against the walls like floodwater. Tick, tick, tick. The cheap plastic clock above the filing cabinet was the only thing brave enough to make a sound. My mother was the first to break. Her eyes widened and her hand flew to her mouth. She made a small, strangled noise in the back of her throat. Maria, she whispered. It was a question as if she were seeing a ghost. My father squinted. He leaned forward over the desk, his glasses sliding down his nose. He looked confused, like he was trying to solve a math problem that didn't make sense. Maria, he repeated. What are you doing here? David didn't look confused. He looked at my suit. He looked at the leather briefcase in my hand. Then he looked at my face, and his lip curled. He laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, a bark. Well, look at that, David said, pushing himself off the filing cabinet. The maid came back. Did Aunt Clara finally kick you out? Be quiet, David, I said. My voice was calm. It was the voice I used in board meetings when a junior executive spoke out of turn. David blinked. He wasn't used to that tone. Not from me. You don't tell me to be quiet. He snapped, his face reddening. This is a private meeting. We're waiting for a representative from a finance firm. Get out. I am the representative, I said. I walked to the chair opposite my father's desk and sat down. I didn't ask permission. I crossed my legs and placed the folder on my lap. I am Highland Holdings, I said. My father sat back in his chair, the springs creaking loudly. You're a child. You're my child. I am 29 years old, Dad. I run a logistics network that covers 3 states. And I am the only reason the bank hasn't padlocked your doors yet. The shock on their faces began to fade, replaced by something uglier, something familiar, entitlement. My father's posture changed. He straightened up. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile of a man who thinks he just won the lottery. Well, he said, spreading his hands. Well, this is wonderful. My own daughter a success, I knew it. I always said you had grit. You said I was an expense, I reminded him. He waved his hand dismissively. Oh, Maria, don't dwell on the past. We did what we had to do. Look at you now. You're rich. You can help us. Help you? I asked. The debt, my mother chimed in, leaning forward. She reached across the desk, trying to touch my hand. I pulled it back. The debt is $2.5 million, sweetheart. It's a lot for us, but for a big company. Surely you can write it off. Or loan it to us. We're family. Family, I repeated. The word tasted like ash. Yes, family, David said. He walked over to the desk, standing over me, trying to use his height to intimidate me. It didn't work. It's your duty. We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 14 years. You owe us. I looked up at him. You didn't raise me, David. You outsourced me. We sent you to a good home, my father shouted. His temper was flaring now. The proud father act dropped as soon as I didn't open the checkbook immediately. We sent you to your aunt so you wouldn't starve. We made a sacrifice. You sacrificed me, I said. You kept David because you said he was an asset. You sent me away because you said I was a liability. You told me there wasn't enough food on the table for everyone. There wasn't, my mother cried. Tears began to well up in her eyes. I had seen those tears 1,000 times. They were her primary currency. We were destitute. We had to choose, and you chose wrong, I said. I opened the folder on my lap. I'm not here to talk about your parenting. I'm here to talk about your business, or what's left of it. I pulled out a sheet of paper. You owe $1.2 million to the bank. I read, you owe $400,000 in back taxes, and you owe $900,000 to your suppliers. My father slammed his hand on the desk. The suppliers are crooks. They turned on us. It's a conspiracy, Maria. They want the small guy to fail. They blacklisted us for no reason. Greenbelt Farms, I said. Valley Fresh Distribution, Apex Produce. Thieves, my father spat. All of them. They stopped delivering because they want to drive us out of business so the big chains can take over. It's just bad luck. It's not bad luck, I said quietly. It's an algorithm. My father paused. What? It's an automated risk assessment algorithm, like I explained. When an account is 90 days overdue, the system locks it. No more deliveries, no more credit. It's automatic. How do you know that? David asked. He looked nervous now. How do you know how their systems work? I stood up. I smoothed the front of my jacket. I know, I said, looking directly at my father, because I wrote the policy. The room went dead silent. Even the clock seemed to stop. I don't understand, my mother whispered. Highland Holdings is a shell company, I said. It's a holding firm for my assets. My primary company is Morton Logistics. I pointed to the folder on the desk. I bought Valley Fresh Distribution 4 years ago, I said. I bought Greenbelt's shipping contract 2 years ago. I control the trucks. I control the warehouses. I control the food. My father's face went pale. He slumped back into his chair, looking like a marionette whose strings had been cut. You, he rasped, you cut us off. I didn't cut you off, I said. I didn't even know it was you. My system treats every client the same. You stopped paying your bills. The computer flagged you as a credit risk. It stopped the trucks. I walked around the desk so I was standing right next to him. I looked down at the man who had once terrified me. He looked small. You haven't been fighting the economy, Dad. You haven't been fighting bad luck. You've been fighting me. David backed away, bumping into the filing cabinet. You did this on purpose. You vindictive little... I did nothing on purpose. I snapped, turning on him. I didn't even know this store was still open until the liquidation notice hit my desk this morning. That is how irrelevant you are to the market. You are a rounding error in my quarterly report. We are your parents, my mother screamed. She was sobbing openly now. Hey, how can you be so cruel? We are starving. Look at the store. We have nothing. I know, I said. I saw the bananas rotting on the dock. I saw the empty shelves. It reminds me of something. I leaned in close to my mother. It reminds me of my dinner plate when I was 14. Do you remember Mom 1 scoop of potatoes, half a scoop of peas, while David ate pork chops? He was a growing boy, she wailed, And I was a growing girl, I shouted. My voice echoed off the cheap paneling. But you looked at me and you saw a mouth you didn't want to feed. You sent me to scrub floors for Aunt Clara so you could save $50 a week on groceries. And now you want me to use the fortune I built on those scrubbed floors to save you. You have to? David said. His voice was shaking, but he was still trying to demand. You have the money. $2.5 million is nothing to you. Write the check, pay off the debt, give us the store back. Give it back? I laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. David, you ran this business into the ground. You have no inventory. You have no credit. You have no reputation. I have the name, David shouted. Morton's Market. It's our name. It's my name too, I said. And frankly, you're embarrassing it. I looked at my watch. It is 4:00 p.m., I said. The bank closes at 5 Omenage. The auction is at noon tomorrow. Once the gavel falls, the property is sold to the highest bidder, the inventory is liquidated, and you three are evicted. Evicted? My father looked up, terror in his eyes. We live in the apartment upstairs. If we lose the store, we lose the house. I know, I said. It's just math, Dad. Maria, please, my mother begged. She reached for my hand again. This time I let her touch my sleeve. Her fingers were cold. We have nowhere to go. We have no savings. We put everything into the store. That was a poor investment strategy, I said. Don't do this, my father whispered. Don't let them take it. Don't let us end up on the street. I looked at them. The three of them. My father who had chosen money over his daughter. My mother who had chosen silence over her child. My brother who had chosen the pork chop over his sister. They were terrified. They were desperate. They were exactly where I had been 14 years ago, standing in the rain with a trash bag of clothes waiting for a ride to a life they didn't choose. I can stop the auction, I said. The hope in their eyes was instantaneous. It was pathetic. I can write a check for $2.5 million right now, I said. I can clear the debt. I can restock the shelves by tomorrow morning. I can have a fleet of Valley Fresh trucks here at dawn. Yes, my father cried. He stood up, reaching for me. Yes, oh Maria, thank you, thank you. I knew you were a good girl. I knew you loved us. Sit down, I said. He froze. I didn't say I was going to give you the money, I said. I said I can stop the auction. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single document. It wasn't a check. It was a contract. I slammed it onto the desk. The sound was like a gunshot. This is a purchase agreement, I said. Purchase? David asked. I'm not paying your debt, I said. I'm buying it. If I write that check, I own the debt. And if I own the debt, I own the collateral. I looked my father in the eye. I will save Morton's Market, I said. But you won't own it. I will. You can't be serious, David said. You want to steal our business. It's not stealing, David, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. It's a liquidation. You are bankrupt. You have zero equity. You have zero leverage. You have 3 options. I held up 3 fingers. Option 1, you refuse. The bank sells the building tomorrow. You are evicted. You are homeless by Friday. I lowered 1 finger. Option 2, you beg the bank for more time. They will say no. See, option 1. I lowered the 2nd finger. Option 3, you sign this store over to me, right now. Lock, stock, and barrel. I pay the debt. The store stays open. And us? My mother asked, her voice trembling. What happens to us? I looked at her. I thought about the cold nights in Aunt Clara's attic. I thought about the hunger. That, I said, depends entirely on how useful you can be. My father stared at the contract. The paper was white and crisp against the scarred wood of the desk. He looked at the pen I had placed next to it. It was a heavy gold fountain pen. "You're holding us hostage," he whispered. "No, Dad," I said. "I'm offering you a meal, which is more than you did for me." I tapped the face of my watch. "You have 5 minutes to decide. After that, I walk out that door and I don't come back." I leaned back in the chair and waited. Tick, tick, tick. The ticking of the clock seemed to get louder. Tick, tick, tick. It was the only sound in the room for a long time. The bluster was gone. The anger was gone. What was left was the heavy, wet silence of fear. My father picked up the contract. His hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled. He looked at the legal terms, then he looked at me. His eyes were watery and rimmed with red. He didn't look like the tyrant who had banished me from the dinner table. He looked like an old man who had just realized winter was coming, and he had no coat. David was the first to break the silence. He pushed himself off the filing cabinet, his arrogance deflating into a desperate kind of hustle. "Maria," he said, his voice pitching up into a whine. "Listen, let's be reasonable. You're a CEO. You can't run a grocery store. You have logistics to manage. You need someone on the ground. Someone with experience." He smoothed his dirty apron. "I can be the general manager," he said. "I know the layout. I know the potential customers. You buy the debt, keep the name, and I'll run the floor. I'll report to you. Brother and sister. Partners." I looked at him. He was actually serious. After driving the business into the ground, he still thought he deserved a title. "David," I said softly, "you let $3,000 worth of produce rot on the dock because you didn't want to move it in the rain. You aren't a manager. You're a liability." "I can learn," he pleaded. "I just need a chance. You can't just fire your own brother." "I'm not firing you," I said. "You don't work for me yet." My mother let out a sob. She slumped forward, putting her head in her hands. "We'll pay you back," she wept. "Maria, please. Just loan us the money. We promise. We'll work day and night. We'll pay back every cent." I looked at her gray hair, messy and unkempt. I felt a twinge in my chest, a small, sharp ache. It was guilt. They were pathetic. They were ruined. Was I really going to do this? Was I really going to strip them of the only thing they had left? I had the money. I could write the check as a gift and walk away. I could go back to my warehouse, back to my clean, ordered life, and never see them again. I looked at the pen. My hand hovered over the checkbook. Maybe mercy was just letting go. Then the door to the office opened. It wasn't the wind. It was a firm, deliberate turn of the handle. My father jumped. "We're closed." He shouted, his nerves frayed. "Get out." A woman stepped into the room. She was short, stout, and wearing a sensible wool coat that had seen better decades. She carried a large handbag and walked with a cane, but she didn't lean on it. She used it like a scepter. It was Mrs. Higgins. My parents stared at her. It took them a moment to place the face. "Clara's cook," my mother whispered. "The help." Mrs. Higgins didn't look at them. She looked at me. She nodded, a short, sharp gesture of respect. Then she turned her gaze to my parents. "Mrs. Higgins," I said, standing up. "Thank you for coming." "I wouldn't miss it," she said. Her voice was like gravel wrapped in velvet. "What is she doing here?" David sneered. "This is a family meeting. We don't need the staff listening in." Mrs. Higgins walked past David as if he were a piece of furniture. She stood next to my chair. She smelled of yeast and rosemary, the smell of the kitchen where I had spent my teenage years. "I am here," Mrs. Higgins said, "because Maria asked for a witness, and because I know where the bodies are buried." "We have nothing to say to you," my father muttered, looking away. "You're just a servant." I was the one who fed your daughter, Mrs. Higgins said. The room went quiet again. Mrs. Higgins took a step toward the desk. She looked down at my father. Do you remember the night you dropped her off? She asked. It was November 14th, 2011. You pulled up to the service entrance. You didn't even go to the front door. You dropped her bag in the mud, told her to be good, and drove away before she could even ring the bell. My father didn't answer. He stared at his hands. She was 14. Mrs. Higgins continued. She weighed 90 pounds. I brought her into the kitchen. I made her tomato soup. She ate it so fast, she burned her mouth, but she didn't stop. She was afraid I would take the bowl away. I closed my eyes. I could still taste that soup. It was the first time in a year I had felt full. I taught her, Mrs. Higgins said, her voice rising. I taught her how to inventory the pantry. I taught her how to negotiate with the butcher for the best cuts. I taught her that waste is a sin. While you were here letting this boy, she pointed a cane at David, eat the profits, Maria was learning how to run a kitchen, and then a house, and then a company. She's our blood, my mother whimpered. She has our talent. Mrs. Higgins laughed. It was a dry, dismissive sound. She has nothing of yours, Mrs. Higgins said. She built an empire on the skills of a servant. I taught her the value of a potato. You only taught her the pain of hunger. She looked at the purchase agreement on the desk. You have no claim on her harvest, Mrs. Higgins said firmly. You didn't plant the seeds. You didn't water the soil. You just threw the sapling over the fence because it was taking up too much room. She turned to me and placed a warm, calloused hand on my shoulder. Do what you need to do, Maria. Don't let them guilt you. They didn't feel guilty when they watched your taillights fade down the driveway. The guilt I had felt a moment ago vanished. It evaporated like steam. Mrs. Higgins was right. They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a resource. When I was a child, I was a resource that cost too much, so they discarded me. Now I was a resource that had value, so they wanted to claim me. It wasn't love. It was consumption. I bet they didn't see that coming, being told off by the family cook. If you guessed that Mrs. Higgins was the secret weapon, let me know in the comments. I picked up the contract. I smoothed it out on the desk. Thank you, Mrs. Higgins, I said. I looked at my father. His face was gray. He knew the emotional blackmail hadn't worked. He knew the family card had been declined. The offer stands, I said. I am not giving you a loan. I am not giving David a job as a manager. I am acquiring the asset. I uncapped the heavy gold fountain pen and held it out to him. Sign the building over to me, or explain to the bank why you turned down a solvent buyer. My father looked at the pen. He looked at the crumbling ceiling tiles of the office. He looked at David, who was staring at his shoes, defeated. He reached out his shaking hand and took the pen. We need to eat, he whispered. We have no money for groceries. I know, I said. That's why you're going to sign. He bent over the paper. The scratching of the nib on the page was loud and final. He signed his name. Then he passed the pen to my mother. She cried as she signed, dropping a tear onto the ink, making it run. David didn't have to sign. He owned nothing. He just watched his inheritance vanish. I took the paper back. I checked the signatures. It was done. Morton's Market, I said, folding the document and placing it in my briefcase, is now a subsidiary of Morton Logistics. So what now? David asked, his voice hollow. You kick us out. No, I said. I told you, I'm not cruel, I'm practical. I stood up. I buttoned my jacket. The store opens at 8 a.m. tomorrow. The trucks from Valley Fresh will be here at 6:00 a.m. to restock the perishables. Who's going to unload them? David asked. We can't afford staff. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. You are, I said. I walked to the door, Mrs. Higgins beside me. I paused with my hand on the knob. I need 3 stock clerks, I said. Minimum wage. No benefits for the first 90 days. You'll report to the new general manager I'm sending over from corporate. My father looked up, his jaw dropping. You want us to stock shelves in our own store? It's not your store, I corrected him. And yes, if you want to eat, you will work. You will unload the trucks. You will sweep the floors. You will rotate the stock. I looked at David. And David, if I see 1 crate of bananas left out in the rain, you're fired. I opened the door. The sound of the rain outside rushed in to meet us. See you at 6, I said. And I walked out, leaving them in the office they used to own with the job they used to think was beneath them. The rain had stopped by the time we reached the car, leaving the asphalt slick and black, reflecting the neon lights of the city like a mirror. I sat behind the steering wheel, but I didn't start the engine. The silence in the cabin was heavy, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the office. It was the silence of a storm that had finally blown itself out. Mrs. Higgins sat in the passenger seat. She adjusted her handbag on her lap, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Did I do the right thing? I asked. My voice was quiet. Mrs. Higgins didn't look at me. She just watched a droplet of water trace a path down the glass. The right thing isn't always the soft thing, Maria, she said. You didn't give them what they wanted. You gave them what they needed. They wanted a bailout, I said. They wanted permission to stay the same, she corrected. They wanted to keep playing the lords of the manor while the castle crumbled. You took away the castle, but you gave them a shovel. That is more mercy than they showed you. I looked back at the store. The lights in the office window were still on. I could imagine them up there, surrounded by the wreckage of their pride, realizing that for the first time in 40 years, they weren't the owners. They were the help. I had spent 14 years wondering what I would do if I ever had power over them. In my darkest moments alone in Aunt Clara's attic, I imagined buying the building and evicting them. I imagined watching them stand on the sidewalk with their suitcases just as I had done. I imagined driving past them and splashing them with mud. That would have been revenge, and revenge is easy. It is as easy as striking a match. But what I had just done, that was something else. It felt heavier. It felt like responsibility. I turned the key. The engine purred to life, a deep, steady rhythm that vibrated through the seat. Let's go home, I said. 3 weeks later. The morning air was crisp. It was 6 o'clock, and the sun was just beginning to bleed orange over the industrial skyline. I parked my car across the street from Morton's Market. I wasn't there to micromanage. I had a regional manager for that now. I was just watching. The transformation was visible from the street. The faded sign had been cleaned. The graffiti on the brickwork had been scrubbed away. The windows, once clouded with grime, were sparkling. Behind the glass, I could see rows of colorful produce pyramids of oranges, stacks of green peppers, baskets of red apples. The shelves were full. The extra mouth problem had been solved not by removing a person, but by adding competence. A delivery truck from Valley Fresh hissed to a halt at the loading dock. The air brakes sighed. The back gate of the store opened. My father walked out. He looked different. He wasn't wearing his suit and tie. He was wearing a blue work shirt and heavy boots. He walked slower than the other workers, his back stiff, but he was moving. He carried a clipboard, but not to give orders. He was checking the manifest against the boxes. Then came David. He was wearing a back brace and gloves. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of early mornings and hard labor. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't leaning against the wall, complaining about the economy. He walked to the back of the truck. The driver pushed a dolly stacked high with crates of milk onto the lift gate. David stepped forward, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It was heavy work. I could see the strain in his neck. I could see him grunt with the effort. He wheeled the milk into the warehouse, then came back out for the potatoes. 50-pound sacks. He threw one over his shoulder. He staggered slightly, caught his balance, and kept walking. He was working. My mother appeared in the doorway. She was holding a broom. She swept the concrete pad of the dock, clearing away the debris from the morning delivery. She wasn't the lady of the house anymore. She was a worker keeping her station clean. At noon, the whistle blew. I watched them sit down on the edge of the loading dock. They didn't go to a fancy lunch. They opened brown paper bags. My father took out a sandwich. My mother handed David an apple. They ate in silence. They ate with the specific focused hunger of people who have been using their bodies. I watched David bite into the apple. He chewed slowly. He didn't look entitled to it. He looked like he was tasting it for the first time. When you work for your food, it tastes different. It tastes like dignity. I rolled down my window. The sounds of the city drifted in the traffic, the distant sirens, the murmur of life. I thought about the lesson I had learned in Mrs. Higgins's kitchen all those years ago. If you don't work, you don't eat. It was a harsh rule for a child, but it was the law of the world. My parents had tried to break that law. They tried to eat without working. They tried to harvest without planting. And when the math didn't add up, they subtracted me. But the math always wins in the end. I shifted the car into gear. I didn't need to go over there. I didn't need to hear them say thank you. The sight of them on that dock eating bread they had earned with the sweat of their brow was enough. I wasn't the angry girl anymore. I wasn't the victim. I was the provider. I spoke to the empty car, testing the words on my tongue. Revenge is letting them starve. I said softly, justice is letting them pay. I looked at my father, brushing crumbs from his lap and standing up to get back to work. But mercy, I whispered. Mercy is giving them the shovel so they can dig themselves out. They are no longer my parents. They are my employees. And for the first time in their lives, they are earning their keep. I watched them for one last second. David lifted a crate of bananas carefully this time and disappeared into the cool, stocked depths of the store. They were safe. They were fed. And they were mine. I merged into traffic, leaving the past in the rearview mirror, and drove toward the warehouse. I had work to do. Thank you for spending time with us today. If this story touched your heart, and if you believe that dignity is the greatest gift you can give someone, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us tell more stories like this. See you in the next video. It takes incredible strength to choose mercy over revenge. Have you ever faced a family member who only valued you when you had something to give? Don't be shy to share your experiences below. Your story might be the inspiration for our future episodes. We read every single comment. We truly appreciate you being here. There are even more captivating stories waiting for you right on your screen. Please click one now so you don't miss the ending. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. This has been a story from Revenge Radiance. We'll see you next time.